One, two, three.
The following is the full uncut conversation on the fight for fair wages and anti-racist unions from our Meet the BIPOC Press series.
In 2023, more than 450,000 workers have gone on strike in this country, and the action shows no sign of stopping soon. From auto plants to Amazon warehouses to Hollywood studios, pharmacies, and hospitals, workers have been taking to the streets, and many in the labor press are celebrating this revival of labor power. But what does it all mean for workers of color, often the hardest hit and least well treated, even by the traditional labor organizations that claim to represent them? And what happens when media bring a race-smart angle to their reporting of this issue? For this month's episode of our regular feature, Meet the BIPOC Press, I'm joined once again by Sara Lomax of Philadelphia's WURD Radio. She's also co-founder of URL Media, a network of independent media owned and operated by people of color. Great to have you with us again, Sara.
So good to see you and to be here, Laura. I'm so excited about this conversation. This topic about unions and all the union activity that's happening around the country is so nuanced in my view, because there is a racial dynamic to it that needs to be explored. And I'm looking forward to exploring it today, because for Black people, unions have a history of locking Black folks out from a racial standpoint. And so that was the impetus of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters that was started by A. Philip Randolph in 1925 to really advocate for Black workers in particular, because they were not supported and welcomed into white labor unions. So looking forward to having a discussion about what this means specifically for Black and brown communities.
Well, joining us to continue this discussion, our reporter Amir Khafagy. He's on the ground in Queens, New York. He's reporting on that intersection of labor and immigration and race at Documented. And on the West Coast, from Hayward, California, we have news editor Carolyn Copeland, who's tracking national labor coverage with her team at Prism, which is an independent nonprofit newsroom run by journalists of color. So welcome both of our guests. I guess I'm going to start with you, Carolyn. Let's start with the good news. What are workers celebrating as we start this conversation?
Well, I think it really depends on which union you're referring to. If you're going to speak about workers at Kaiser, for example, who just secured a contract last week, 75,000 Kaiser workers across the country went on strike. I think it was a 3-day strike this month, I should say, across the country. They just averted a 7-day strike in November, and they made very few concessions. That was a major victory, and that's something that's rare in union negotiations and collective bargaining. UPS workers who averted a massive strike also last month, they would have been, I think it was 340,000 workers. I might be a little off on those numbers, but not by much. They averted a massive strike. They also didn't make very many concessions. So that's a big victory. So workers everywhere are really getting some big victories right now.
And I wanted to stick with you, Carolyn, because I want us to kind of back up a little bit and talk about, these workplace battles about power. How are unions facilitating worker power? And because we know that they haven't always advocated and really facilitated power when it comes to racial justice and Black power.
Well, if you're asking about how unions are forming in hostile environments, that's something that we've been covering pretty extensively at Prism. We've been doing a lot of coverage on union busting that's been happening. It's pretty serious. We haven't been seeing a lot of that being covered in the national media, unfortunately. When you see coverage, let me think of just one example. Color of Change, for example, we just did a piece on the civil rights nonprofit Color of Change. It was a follow-up piece to reporting that was done by Insider Insider published a piece on some sexual assault allegations and some workers' rights violations that they did. But they sort of glossed over some of the union busting that they did. So we followed up with reporting. Our reporter, Alexandra Martinez, followed up with reporting on the union busting and how that was hurting their advocacy. Their union busting and some of how they treated their workers was impacting their advocacy as a civil rights organization. So it's a major issue.
In principle, how is it supposed to work? Let me come to you, Amir, just for people that are not familiar with the whole idea of collective bargaining and why it matters. You come to this work, as I understand it, from activism. In principle, how are unions supposed to help workers in those worker-employer battles over power?
A very good question. I often find it that many workers themselves don't know how unions work in general. They feel that unions sometimes they don't have much education about how important unions are in terms of advocating for the workers. So in general, what a union's supposed to do is really give a collective voice for the workers, right? And it comes from the idea that a single worker cannot go to the boss and say, listen, I have all these grievances. I want you to fix my problems and all the issues that we're having at the workplace. The boss can simply fire that single worker. But if the workers come together as a group and say, listen, we have this collective issue and we need these things to be addressed, or we need some sort of change, they have more power in their numbers. Thus, the boss would be more likely to concede to some of these demands in order to keep some of the workplace peace. So essentially, a union, forget all the bureaucracy that has come over the years and stuff. A union is essentially workers coming together, demanding rights in the workplace, or demanding a better workplace.
So obviously it's a problem when certain groups of workers are actually forbidden to belong to unions, as Sara pointed out at the top of the show. That's part of the history of the trade union movement. But you wrote as recently as 2020 about workers coming together, making demands, and finding themselves stalled or blocked not only by the industry, but by the union that's supposed to represent them.
Yes, sometimes unions don't always represent the best interest of the workers. And that's why the union democracy movement is very important. That doesn't get much coverage in the mainstream media, especially in this conversation we're having about this resurgence of unionization and workers' power. But there are workers fighting within their own unions to demand better working conditions. There's some workers within unions who are organizers, as the workers in Los Angeles for SEIU 32BJ. They were organizing themselves to demand better working conditions because union organizers often are exploited themselves. So there are movements, especially like in New York with the home care workers, who were fighting against their own unions, SEIU, and they were demanding, listen, we don't want this 24-hour workday. This is exhausting for us. This is killing us slowly. And we want some sort of law that gets passed, some legislative law, because they didn't have any confidence that the boss would just end 24-hour workdays because that's an industry-wide standard, and demanding legislation to address this. And they found that their own union was blocking that. So they were going against their own union, even going so far as suing their own union to get their rights. And
what happened? How did the union respond?
They essentially tried to kill the bill, and they were lobbying heavily at City Hall. It was a city bill. They were lobbying heavily to kill the bill, and they had a rally outside City Hall. The union themselves, while the workers were protesting, demanding the passage of this bill, the union was across the street having a chant, kill the bill, kill the bill. And it was really demoralizing for a lot of the workers who belonged to that union.
Has anything changed? I just have to find out, has anything changed since 2020?
They're still fighting. There's a state law and there's a city law that they're trying to push, and they're coming against a lot of opposition. They just had a rally yesterday, so it's still ongoing, and they're still fighting.
And I'm curious, and I'm going to stick with you, Amir, because we know that there are widespread actions happening right now from, like the auto workers, Starbucks, Amazon. There's a lot of unionization activity right now and union activism. What is the differentiator between those actions that are working and those that are not actually resulting in actual benefits for the members?
it's a bit complicated. So a lot of like what we're seeing at Starbucks, right? It seems to be a lot of younger, new people coming into the union movement. Um, they're kind of interjecting a new sense of energy and a new sense of identity into these union movements that are happening, because they don't have the burden of the legacy unions coming in and kind of imposing what's possible. I think what's a great example of what was possible was what happened in Amazon, right? That was an independent union movement on Staten Island in New York City, where the workers rejected a mainstream union coming in and telling them, hey, you can't do this, you can't do that. They said, well, we have a direct relationship with the workers because we are the workers, and we're going to approach unionization in a brand new viewpoint. We're not going to go in and say you have to have a certain threshold of people to say we want to join the union before we can even do a vote for a union. Let's just organize to do the vote. And it was successful. They have struggles now. There's a lot of internal struggle in terms of how to get a collective bargaining agreement, which is very complicated in of itself. But they were successful in the sense that, hey, it's not impossible to organize these big warehouses like Amazon. Unions have often struggled to organize places like Amazon and Walmart for various reasons. And I think one of the main reasons was they just really didn't have people on the ground inside these workplaces meeting the needs, the day-to-day needs of the workers. But what the Amazon labor union was able to do is to say was, we are the workers. We know the day-to-day needs of what the workers need and want and demand, and they were able to address that and relate and build a union there.
Coming to you, Carolyn, you see everything that comes through the news desk there at Prism that has to do with labor, and I was struck by how many stories are not actually about trade unions. So can you talk about how else workers are, improving their conditions, workers' centers, community organizations, and so on?
Well, one main thing that we've been reporting on lately, or one story that we've been following, I should say, is the heat protections that workers in Miami have been fighting for. Outdoor laborers have been pushing for a heat ordinance that could become the first in the country. And outdoor laborers meaning, gardeners, farmers, who are not even allowed to take breaks to have a sip of water. Some are not even allowed to drink water to go to the restroom. Or they're not allowed to drink water because it would cause them to go to the restroom. And so they're trying to outlaw that. And that would be the first countywide ordinance like that in the entire country. So that's one way they're pushing for it. We're doing some coverage in Miami around an ancient Tequesta site. And this is coverage that isn't covered by the Miami Herald. This is just coverage that we're doing at Prism on workers who are filing a claim against, or these are archaeologists who are filing a claim against their company for cancer-causing chemicals that they're being exposed to while working on this site. So these are just two examples in one city, but we're seeing things like this all across the country. And it could get a precedent.
So if they're not working, strictly speaking, through the union, who are they working with?
Well, they're working, through attorneys, but worker power. And also, when one person comes to a news outlet or an independent news outlet like Prism, we have found that it causes more people to speak up. And when that happens, things kind of come together, and sometimes, lawsuits get formed when they realize that this is a bigger problem. We saw that, going back to, a whole different topic, Me Too, when more people come forward, it becomes a way bigger issue, lawsuits get formed, and maybe something could get resolved. You never know.
I'm curious about, and this is for you, Carolyn, we'll stay with you. What are the responses from the corporations and like management? We know that there's union busting happening, but I'm curious also, how are some organizations, as these movements continue to expand, doing things to thwart or to avoid proactively union walkouts or activations? Are you seeing anything like that in your reporting?
Well, there are a lot of things that that corporations are doing to union vest. One thing that happens a lot is captive audience meetings, which is essentially when unions hold mandatory meetings to discourage unions or just talk about how bad they are. Another thing that people do just to thwart the forming of a union is that they will just start giving benefits to people who or not thwart the forming of a union, but when a union is already formed, maybe they'll start giving benefits to other people outside of that to sort of discourage people who are starting to discourage new employees from joining the union. There's a long list of things they'll do. They'll cut hours. They will close down stores. We've seen Starbucks do that. There's a lot of ways, and they also will hire law firms to minimize union power. We're seeing that with companies like Starbucks as well.
Well, I was just curious, if you're talking about intimidation tactics, I'm wondering again about
Laura?
racism and sexism in the workplace. I'm assuming that those tactics might also work to divide and conquer and intimidate the most vulnerable. Is that what you're seeing too, Carolyn?
Well, whenever you're talking about unions, you're always talking about people of color because people of color are more likely to belong to a union. Black people in particular are more likely to belong to a union. Going back to what we were talking about with the Kaiser strike, more Black and brown people belong to that union. I think I want to say, I hope I'm getting the statistic right, I think it's something like 60% of Kaiser Permanente workers were Black or brown. So, union issues are always a racial justice issue. So yes, that's always at play. And that's largely, not completely, but largely because unions help bridge the racial wage gap.
I am based in Philadelphia. I run a Black Talk station in Philadelphia, and there has been a generational concern in Philadelphia about kind of the racial gap in access to union participation. There has been, and that has been identified as a reason for maintaining kind of the racial wealth gap, that a lot of Black, in particular, workers have not been able to join some of the unions in Philadelphia, some of the skilled trades, et cetera. And it's really created, a racial hierarchy in the unions. And so I'm just curious, and maybe I'll throw this to Amir. You're in New York City. You're working with Documented. I'm wondering if you're seeing anything like that happening in terms of access to the unions contemporarily.
That's a very good question. New York and Philadelphia are sister cities, so the conditions in Philadelphia are probably very similar to New York. Worker centers have historically been a great way for workers who have not been organized into traditional unions to assert some of their collective rights as workers, right? So oftentimes worker centers have organized construction workers, have organized home care workers, restaurant workers, the Chinese Staff and Workers Association is one great example. The Laundry Worker Center, which organizes laundry workers, is another great example of a worker center really reaching out to workers that haven't been who have been excluded historically from the mainstream unions, and giving them a sense of power and collective rights. What I've been seeing in New York is very interesting. Historically, the trade unions have been some of the most exclusionary unions when it comes to Black and Latino workers. They oftentimes have been traditionally Italian, Irish workers that pass the jobs along generationally, right? We have this sense of the burly trade union white guy that sometimes votes Republican. That's like the sense we get. But lately, what we've seen now is the trade unions have become to realize that their historical animosity they had, especially towards immigrant workers and Black and Latino workers in general, has actually hurt their movement, right? because what happened was that the fact that they excluded those groups from their unions allowed exploitative contractors and employers to take advantage of that by hiring Black and Latino workers, paying them less and giving them worse working conditions. But because those workers couldn't join a union, they would take those jobs because it was the best opportunity they had to even get a construction job in the first place, thus lowering the standards for all workers in that industry as a whole. So now, like a great example is the Building Trades Union, Local 79 in New York. They've taken extraordinary efforts in organizing immigrant workers, in organizing Black workers, and trying to get them into the unions, because instead of their historical idea of competing against them, they realized that they have to join them in order to survive, because those workers were getting those jobs anyway, and it was bringing the standards down for everyone. So historically, the racism that these trade unions especially, and the union movement as a whole, especially the AFL-CIO, their racism has actually hurt the union movement in this country as a whole and has lowered the standards for all workers.
That's really powerful, Amir. And can you just, again, I know you've made the distinction a few times between the difference between kind of established unions and kind of worker centered union organizing. Can you just like clarify that one more time so that our listeners, our viewers can be clear on the differentiation between those two kind of union structures?
Certainly. So I guess in the broadest sense, anytime workers get together and start demanding something from their boss, rather formally or informally, that would be considered a union. The fact that workers come together and they start complaining about what's happening and decide, hey, we're going to maybe write a letter to the boss and see what he says or they say, that's considered a union. But to be more specific, a union generally means you're part of an organization, you pay dues, you have a collective bargaining agreement with your boss in which you have a contract that says how much you get paid, what your health benefits are, what all your other perks would be, your pension, whatever it is, whatever that was agreed upon in that collective bargaining agreement. And that contract would last, 5 years, let's say. And then every 5 years or whatever, you would negotiate a new contract, and different conditions would exist, and you would bargain for that. A worker center isn't that traditional model. What it does, though, is it organizes workers for the same thing, to achieve some sort of benefit at the workplace, some sort of change in the workplace, without the benefit of having a written contract that says this is what you're going to get, this is how much dues you're going to get paid. Are you going to pay, even though some worker centers do have a due paying structure? It's not as formal as a solid union in which you have a contract that all workers operate under. Does that make sense? Is it a little more clear?
Thanks a lot for that, Amir. I'm coming to you, Carolyn. It is striking to think how recent the sort of 180-degree turn in the labor movement has been with respect to immigration. And I want to ask Amir to weigh in on this too, but from your perspective, what are you seeing as the impacts of the sort that Amir's describing on the labor movement and the labor organizing that you see, of the fact that finally in 2000, the AFL-CIO Executive Board decided to reverse its position on immigration and support legal routes to citizenship for undocumented workers? What difference has that made to this moment, do you think?
I don't know, if I don't have a lot of that information in front of me. I don't know if I would be the best person to talk about it. Our reporter, Alexandra Martinez, is way better versed in that than me. So I would actually defer to Amir.
All right, back to Amir on that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's been transformative. Like I said earlier, historically, especially the AFL-CIO has had a very anti-immigration stance. They often saw immigrant workers as competitors with people born in the United States, and they often took a very right-wing position when it came to immigration. This reversal has really expanded the scope of what's possible in terms of organizing and embracing immigrant workers. Because when we talk about immigration, it's always a labor conversation. And that gets lost in the messaging when we hear about immigration. It's always about labor, if you notice that. Even now with the asylum seeker crisis happening in New York, it's always, now we're having this conversation about work permits and so on. Labor and immigration are interconnected. They're not two separate issues. Oftentimes the right-wing talking points about immigration is, oh, they're taking jobs away from Americans and so on and so forth. So that whole language and all those concerns and everything else is all mucked up within a labor context. So I think the AFL-CIO realized that the standards were being lowered across the board because their exclusionary rules that they had that barred organizing undocumented workers and immigrant workers in general really hurt workers throughout the country, and it really brought down the standards for everybody. And I think now they're realizing, listen, this was a tactic, and this was an idea that we had that really wasn't working, and it was hurting us, and it was hurting the labor movement, and we really now have to embrace them. Contrary to public knowledge, and a lot of people don't even know this, even within the labor movement, then undocumented workers have a right to join unions. There's no law that says that undocumented workers cannot be in a labor union. So I think now we're seeing, hey, wait a minute, we have to really embrace this cohort of workers, because there's millions of undocumented workers making subpar wages who are just yearning to be organized, and that would really improve labor conditions for everybody.
I see a new organizing front out there in the future, which I'm sure you'll have your eye on, Carolyn, there at PRISM. Coming back to the work that you do and how you prioritize in your reporting with so many stories, what is your particular commitment there at PRISM when it comes to covering these workers' concerns?
Prioritizing worker stories is always where our values lie at PRISM. Because we have such a small staff, we have to prioritize location. So our staff reporters, we try to make sure, like I mentioned before, we do a lot of reporting out of Florida and out of the West Coast, in the Bay Area, just in California in particular. We also rely really heavily on a really strong team of freelancers to do some reporting across the country. We have to cover the major stories, but also to do some enterprise reporting, to cover worker stories about union busting, sexual harassment, grooming, even in some stories we have coming up in the workplace, just to center those voices. So that's really how we prioritize.
I wanted to ask, and this is for both of you, and Carolyn, maybe you can kick us off, because we know that the pandemic really had a direct impact on essential workers, which a lot of those essential workers were, Black and brown workers who were on the front lines, had to go to work every day, and were in direct contact with COVID directly. So I'm curious if both of you can speak to the impact in the aftermath of the pandemic, how that has either ramped up or impacted union organizing for workers who might have really felt the pain and the disproportionate impact on them during the pandemic.
Okay, so yeah, we know that when the pandemic started in 2020, a lot of people were branded as essential workers, and they sort of looked around and they realized that even though they're branded as essential workers, they're bagging groceries for people and putting their lives on the line, but they're being paid just above minimum wage. They are not able to take time off when they're sick, when their partner's sick, or when their child's sick, and they're not being respected in the workplace. And so that right there sort of became a ripple effect, and it caused people to want to sort of fight for their rights in the workplace, or to when it became time to fight for a new contract, to put new things in it. And so that's sort of when the labor movement ramped up. And you're seeing that across different industries as well, with lots of different layoffs that are happening across industries, with massive layoffs across the country. Remote work also has changed the landscape of the economy as well. So, I mean, the pandemic really changed everything about employment and organizing as well. So, you know, we know that unionizing has skyrocketed just in the past couple of years. So, yeah.
Well, you have something. There's an old saying that goes, there's decades where nothing happens, and then there's weeks where decades happen. And I think the pandemic was really encapsulates that. It's like you were saying, it just, people were so frustrated by what was happening with the pandemic and the financial crisis that it caused, that people started to realize, and then this language, oh, you're essential workers, but people were being laid off left and right, and they weren't getting paid for it. People were losing their jobs, their homes, their livelihoods. And although they were celebrated as essential workers and people were going outside their house and clapping every night around 6 o'clock for essential workers, nobody was getting any extra money for that. No, they weren't getting their real respect that they deserved, which was getting paid what they deserved. So I think a lot of workers realized that, hey, we had enough. If we are essential, that means we can stop this country if we stopped our work, if we refuse to continue giving you our labor. So now we're seeing this drive, not only a resurgence in the labor movement of people at traditionally organized workplaces coming out and striking or threatening to strike. We're seeing brand new unionization efforts at places that never were organized, where people thought, oh, it was too hard to organize. You couldn't organize. We're seeing a movement of delivery workers now organizing and demanding their collective rights. Taxi workers are organizing and demanding their collective rights. Home care workers are demanding their rights. So you're seeing all these workers at workplaces that weren't even organized now coming together and saying enough is enough, and we demand our fair share.
I want to go back to where we began, because I'm with you, of course, on the impact that COVID had. But I am struck by how much of the change in the labor movement today is attributed to the impacts of COVID. And I just want to put a pin in the fact that the labor movement, the workforce of this country, has changed, demographically speaking, and that eroding white male supremacy has meant there are new people in power in some trade unions. That, it seems to me, is a kind of the underreported story of this moment. The labor movement is changing in the way that you've described. It's also changing in its demands, with more struggles around. You mentioned, Carolyn, the heat. You've also mentioned, water breaks and so on, environmental justice, racial justice, housing, student debt. I mean, we're seeing everyone from teachers in Chicago to teachers in West Virginia raise these, I think they're called like common good demands, that didn't come from just nowhere. I'll get off my soapbox, but anyone want to weigh in? Amir?
Yeah, labor movements have been in decline for years, right? In the 1950s, almost half the work places in this country were organized, and now almost none are organized. So we're seeing a really big shift in what's possible now, with especially these new industries forming of people demanding new conditions, such as getting air conditioners in their trucks or having water breaks, things like we wouldn't traditionally think that unions would demand. But unions have kind of, in their own way, kind of stunted their own growth by only sticking to small demands, just like a modest pay increase here or there, some modest increases in health insurance. But that's it. A lot of the unions, in fact, have been kind of blocking efforts to try to get universal health care, right? Because they have a lot at stake with their own insurance companies. So there was a lot of the time the unions and the workers were not connected. There was no conversation between the ranking file and the union bureaucracy. But now we're seeing a brand new demographic of people in the unions, not only in race, but also by age. A lot of young people are interested in unions and going into unions, and they're changing the conversation and demanding more than what unions were traditionally offering, and changing the conversation of what is possible. And I think unions began to think a lot like the bosses. And now the young people, and especially people of color, are saying, let's start thinking about what we need and what's possible, not discredit something before we even try it.
And I'm curious, Carolyn, to you. We've talked a lot about the racial dynamics, but there's also gender dynamics because, as Laura mentioned, the stereotypical kind of demographic was kind of like the white male union worker, but we're seeing a lot more women in positions of power, in positions of leadership in unions now. And I'm curious if you've done any reporting with Prism around kind of the gender dynamics and if that's shifting priorities at all in kind of union activism.
Not so much when it comes to what unions are fighting for. We've certainly had workers talk about their experiences in balancing work, or how their employer won't give them time off to deal with their families, because we know that women disproportionately, women and specifically women of color disproportionately have to deal with the burdens of the home, or they're more likely to live in intergenerational households and carry the burdens of that. But we don't see that a lot when it comes to bargaining, at least not right now, and at least not, it's not widespread. But one of the things that unions are asking for a lot right now is time off. So that is something that would impact women, but we're not seeing a lot of increased demands for paid parental leave, and that's something that we're seeing that at the national level that people are calling for, but not so much union by union. So that's something that we obviously hope to see more of as time passes and as more people unionize, and maybe as their next contracts come up, that'll be something they prioritize.
As we move towards the end here, the two of you there at Prism documented. Talk a bit about your message to other journalists. I mean, the sad story is we don't have enough labor beats in this country, period. But you're doing this reporting. Do you always say labor beat? How do you frame this work? And what would be your kind of learnings to your colleagues in the industry? What do they need to be doing differently? Start with you, Carolyn.
I would say that I think that it's easy when doing this type of work. And I think Amir would probably agree, as somebody who's on the ground and interviewing people from such vulnerable populations. It's easy to do this work and sometimes come across as extractive when you're trying to get this information from people, or like you're mining them for information for a story. But to really build trust and to put a worker-centered story out there and to publish it and to give it time, you really have to build those relationships. And that's how you make a really personal, relatable, important story. And that's how you put that together, is by forming those relationships. And that's how you get a reporter like Amir, reporters like we have at Prism. And I think that that's what more journalists need to do, especially journalists that you see at the national level. I see that a lot from independent journalists, but not as much from people in the mainstream, because they're I think a lot of times trying so hard just to get the story out, to get it first, and not so much thinking about the impact that it has on the people that they're some kind of exploiting at the end.
Amir.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, I care about every single story that I do. It means a lot to me. And someone who has been, deeply entrenched in the labor movement in New York, and I have a history with it, and I know it very well. I try to approach every story with as much compassion and empathy as I can, because I really do care about these stories. And I really do want to do my best to try to elevate the voices that often get left at the cutting room floor or are not elevated in the mainstream media. What I always try to do is try to follow these stories. It's never just a one-off story. I try to follow worker struggles as it progresses. I try to find unique angles to things that other reporters might report on as a breaking news, and I try to find the deeper story behind that, because it really means a lot to me to really elevate the voices of those who you don't hear about. And that's kind of my guiding principle when I do this reporting. I always think about the workers themselves, not just the academics or the bureaucrats or the politicians. I try to center their voices above all.
It might make sense for some of those labor union leaders to actually listen.
I agree.
Sara, any closing thoughts from you? What do you think J. Philip Randolph would be thinking of this moment?
Well, I think that I really appreciate the quality and breadth and depth of this conversation, because so often I find mainstream reporting about these movements is very much just about management versus the workers. And I feel like today's conversation was very much looking at the complexity within the union structures. It's much more multidimensional than just, David versus Goliath. There are structures that have to be attended to within the organizing and the union movement, and the evolution of that. And centering the workers is always at the core of reporting like Documented and Prisms, and the work that many of our URL media outlets are pursuing. So I just appreciate this conversation and how we're looking at these issues from a different vantage point than maybe from the mainstream media's perspective.
What are you working on today? What can people look forward to in the near future coming from Prism?
Sure. So we are working on a series that is unofficially titled Who is Organizing the Organizers. We already have part of the series that's out right now, and another part of the series that is dropping in the next few weeks. Basically, what it is investigative pieces on nonprofits that espouse progressive ideals, but behind the scenes mistreat their workers. We recently published an investigative piece on the Animal Legal Defense Fund, Color of Change. We have another one. I'm not going to necessarily say what it is because it's not out yet, but we have a couple more pieces coming down the pike. So definitely look out for that.
What about you, Amir?
I got some good ones coming out soon. Some deeply investigative stories. I don't want to spill the beans just yet, but they're going to be good. But we're also recently released a massive wage theft database, which had it was a huge database that we gathered all this information from the Department of Labor, showing which companies had some of the most wage theft investigations through the Department of Labor. So what we're going to be doing over the past few months, and if not the next year, we're going to be looking into some of the companies that have some of the worst cases and taking a deeper dive into that. So that's something to look forward to, as well as my really good investigations that are coming out. So stay tuned.
All right, Amir Khafagy, Carolyn Copeland, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Great conversation.